This module provides an introductory overview to the topic of immigration and health, beginning with an admittedly very absurdly brief history of immigration in the United States. We can characterize the history of immigration in the U.S. in terms of four major periods of relatively voluntary immigration, starting with the colonial period, then the period of the mid-19th century, which was primarily Northern European immigration streams, and then at the 20th century, more streams coming from Southern and Eastern European countries, and then finally the post-1965 era of immigration, predominantly consisting of immigrants from Asia and Latin America. And what is pivotal here in this history is a couple of specific legislative acts related to the change between the mid-19th century and the turn of the 20th century in the composition of immigrant streams from Europe. With the influx of more individuals coming from Southern and European countries, we had the emergence of a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment and concerns about the loss of some idealized notion of white homogeneity in the population of the U.S., and therefore the Immigration Act of 1924, which set an annual quota for certain nationalities subjected to quotas at 2% annual immigration of the number of foreign-born persons from that nationality who were resident in the continental U.S. in the year of 1890. So if you were not well represented in 1890 as a group, then your 2% quota would not amount to very many new immigrants annually. The Act also had the intent and effect of halting undesirable immigrants from other specific countries, and namely predominantly Asian countries. Many of those countries were subject to the Naturalization Act of 1790 already, which barred immigrants who were not white from certain countries from being naturalized and becoming citizens. And so this act forbade further immigration if any of those persons who were not eligible to be naturalized at some point per the Naturalization Act of 1790. This had the effect of really restricting immigration from, at that time, what was considered highly undesirable immigrant streams from Southern and Eastern European countries, and really effectively prohibiting and blocking further immigration from other countries in Asia that had begun making some inroads in terms of smaller immigrant streams prior to that. This system of national origin quotas remained in place until the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, which abolished quotas. And the effect of the 1965 Act was to really change the racial and ethnic composition of immigrant streams to the U.S. subsequently. So when we talk about the post-1965 era of immigration, we're really referring to this significantly increased proportion of immigrants coming from Asian and Latin American countries that were previously prohibited under these quota and nationality-specific barriers to immigration prior to that. Here you can see what results, and so you can see the early European ancestry origins still dominating. This depicts counties in the U.S. in terms of the ancestry that consists of the most significant size of the population of that county. So here you see all in light blue. These are counties in the U.S. where German origin individuals are the largest population in that county. And you can see we still have a large influence of the original stock of German and English ancestry. And then you see a lot of other, particulars. Here's Mexican origin. Here is African American. The pockets of the original indigenous populations being very discrete and small, tragically. And then you also see Italian concentrations here. Interestingly, this is all American, and I have no idea what that means. This pale yellow is American. So you really see the effects of different waves, and of course the resulting settlement patterns that we're sort of familiar with in terms of how we think about ethnic concentrations in the U.S. In terms of contemporary immigration, in 2010, the census showed that top states who were receiving new immigrants included states like New York, Florida, California, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Texas, and Illinois. Not really anything surprising there. And that the top sending countries at the time for new immigrants were Mexico, China, the Philippines, India, Vietnam, Cuba, and El Salvador. And what you also see as an important contemporary feature of immigration is increasingly more diverse gateway cities, meaning destination points for immigrants where they enter into cities outside of these kind of traditional gateways for immigrants in terms of cities and states, so secondary cities elsewhere in the country. And you also see more secondary destinations where you have high concentrations of first and second generation immigrants who did not enter into that state, subsequently moved to it after being in an original destination state for some time. In terms of the question of immigrant health and immigration and health, there are several reasons why we might consider this worthy of study. One reason is obvious and sort of intrinsic to the demographics of the immigrant population in the U.S., the population size, the growth, and the compositional features of contemporary post-1965 immigrant streams. In 2002, the first generation or foreign-born immigrant population was estimated to be about 33 million, or 11.5% of the total U.S. population. 42% of the foreign-born arrived between 1990 and 2000. And between the same time period, in that 10-year interval, the foreign-born population increased by 57% compared to only a 9.3% increase in the native-born population. So just by virtue of the numbers and the growth in this population, it merits study in terms of understanding how the population health of this group compares to the health of native-born populations. We also have a lot of history of looking at migration as an important instrument of disease transmission, and migrants specifically as, in the more pejorative sense, vectors of disease. And this is an historic concern. It's obviously been incorporated historically into the policies with respect to allowing immigrants to come into the country or being quarantined or sent back based on their health status. More recently, it's been the focus of population health investigation in the context of HIV/AIDS, as migrants have been considered to be an important mobile population that could be implicated in the transmission of some infectious agent across populations. Furthermore, given the specific sexual mode of transmission of HIV/AIDS, migrant populations that are really disruptive of normal social arrangements are often populations where you see the spread of sexually transmitted infections in a higher rates than in a normal stable population where it's not highly sex segregated, where people are in the same place for a long period of time, having families, and so forth. And so this is a long-standing and ongoing reason to care about immigrant health. The third is a little bit more, again, contemporary concern with some historical antecedents. It's also related very much to ideologic interests in immigrant health, in population health, and specific in social epidemiology. And that is looking at the study of immigration and health from a sort of strategic angle, and looking at it as a research opportunity sort of instrumentally in order to understand how social changes that immigrants experience might be relevant for health, and using the experience of profound social changes of immigrants as a way to try to capture or gain insight into population health issues more broadly, ideologic questions more broadly that are relevant to the full population. Historically, in recent history, we've used immigrants to try to disentangle environmental versus genetic determinants of health. And the importance of environmental factors in health outcomes like stroke, disease, heart disease, and mortality was demonstrated, for example, in studies in the 1970s among Japanese immigrants to Hawaii and California. Some of these studies were done by Michael Marmot and colleagues, really trying to compare the cardiovascular health outcomes of Japanese origin individuals in Japan who didn't immigrate, those who immigrated to Hawaii, and those who immigrated to California. So you have a sort of stepwise progression to the mainland U.S. And what they observed was that the closer you were to the mainland U.S., the higher your risk of heart disease. And the fact that this was happening in a really short period of time was very much suggestive at an early point, when we really didn't have other instruments to make these determinations, that environmental factors were important, because these changes could not be attributable to genetic differences, because the population was all Japanese in origin, and you wouldn't expect genetic factors to be operating in such a short interval of time across generations. Now we also use immigrants and immigrant health as an instrumental way to try to understand the role of racial and ethnic differences exposures, the experiences of racialization, and so forth, to understand racial ethnic disparities in health. Because of who immigrates now, this post-1965 immigrant streams are highly subject to processes of racialization and different trajectories of assimilation, given the fact that they can't assimilate into the dominant white population as their predecessors were able to. The focus of immigration and health research really is anchored around two key questions. The first is, what are the determinants of population health among immigrants, and are they comparable across subgroups, as well as to those among the native-born? And the second asks more specifically, how does the immigration experience itself affect health? The literature to date really has a couple of key and very persistent findings that have been the focus of much etiologic investigation. The first key persistent finding is that there seems to be a foreign nativity advantage in both morbidity and mortality, which is often referred to as the immigrant paradox or the healthy immigrant effect, or often the Latino paradox, because it's often studied and found most pronounced among Latino populations, whereby those who are not born in the U.S. or are of Latino origin have a greater health advantage or health status than one would expect given their relatively disadvantaged socioeconomic status. Latinos as a pan-ethnic group and the foreign-born do not have the health disadvantage that one would more intuitively expect given the hardships they've encountered in the process of immigration and the hardships they endure as being immigrants in the U.S. relative to the native-born population. The other empirical regularity is the observed phenomenon that this protective effect does not seem to be sustained over time or duration in the U.S., both within generations and across generations. This health deterioration with exposure to the host country is usually conceived of and measured as time in the U.S. or duration of residence, and it's become the dominant expectation, even though the empirical patterns are not always unambiguous or consistent. For example, one pretty consistent exception to this general trend is physical activity, which seems across many studies to do better with time in the U.S. Often the interpretation of the foreign nativity protective effect is that it's about selection processes, that immigrants are selected on factors related to health, and that these selection processes are what's driving the apparent higher health status of the foreign-born relative to the U.S.-born. However, we seldom have the right data to be able to test this interpretation directly. And the extent to which this empirical pattern is a regularity is actually more complicated than it seems at first glance, with real potential deviation across health outcomes and across immigrant subgroups. Again, most of these empirical patterns have been demonstrated, especially early on, among pan-ethnic groups, Hispanics, Asians, and so forth, or all of the foreign-born versus the U.S.-born. And of course that masks a lot of really important heterogeneity among immigrants that might really show different patterns if we were able to look at them with the same degree of specificity. Here is one illustration going from the pan-ethnic to the national origin subgroups. Here you're looking at the percent obese among Latinos and Asians in the National Latino and Asian American Health Survey in 2002 and 2003. And here these bars represent the different generations of these immigrant groups. The first generation are the foreign-born. The second generation are U.S.-born but have at least one foreign-born parent. And the third generation are those who are U.S.-born and have U.S.-born parents. And you can see that there's a pretty stepwise relationship with increased levels of obesity with the longer generation, the higher generation, both among Latinos and among Asians, with aggregate levels of obesity much higher among Latinos relative to Asians. When you subgroup this and you get down into somewhat more granular perspective on national origin, you see a little bit more complexity emerge. For example, the Puerto Rican subgroup does not follow that pattern. In fact, if anything, the pattern is in the opposite direction, with increasing levels of obesity among the foreign-born relative to the third generation, although these confidence bounds are very overlapping. You see somewhat of a persistence in the pattern among Mexicans and among this catch-all group of other Latinos. For Asians, you see the same sort of stepwise relationship here more apparent, although it's not necessarily uniform. You see some similarity here, for example, between the first and second generation, and also among the first and second generation Chinese, with then a huge difference here in the prevalence of obesity among those in the third generation, really relative to the first and second. When you subgroup it even further, you can see a little bit more complexity here, looking at ethnicity, pan-ethnicity, intersected with education status. Low education refers to those with less than a high school education. High education refers to those with high school education or more. And here you can see that stepwise relationship, more or less, increasing obesity with higher generation. But you again also see that some of the risks, especially among Asians, are really happening at the third generation level relative to the first and second, much lower prevalence here. Interestingly, that here among the lower educated group, the prevalence of obesity is lower relative to the higher education group in the first and second generations. The point here is just that the overall trends, empirical patterning that we observe when we use these large aggregated groups defined in terms of pan-ethnic identification, we're really masking a lot of heterogeneity that we need to be able to capture better if we're really going to understand what these patterns look like.